The storm had been brewing since before dawn, slow at first, like a whisper creeping down from the high peaks. But by mid-morning it had become a howling force of nature. Winds lashed at the mountain pass with merciless teeth, turning the world into a churning white void. Boone Cartwright pulled his duster tighter across his chest, leaning low over his saddle. Every breath turned to steam and vanished. Snow clung to his hat brim, his lashes, his gloves seeping in no matter how he fought it. His horse, Buck, struggled through the drifts with visible effort, snorting clouds of frost into the air. For 3 days, Boone had pushed through rough country, chasing daylight toward the trading post before the real winter set in. But now, he wasn't sure he'd make it at all. The pass had narrowed to a corridor of wind and ice. The trail was gone, buried beneath a foot of fresh powder. Every few minutes he had to stop and let Buck rest, each pause shorter than the last. Even the horse was running out of will. He hadn't seen another soul since the last ridge, and for a moment he let the thought settle in if he died here. Nobody would know. Not for weeks. Maybe months. He flexed his numb fingers inside his gloves, trying to feel something. He muttered to himself, the words stolen by the wind. Come on, Cartwright. 1 more mile. Then he saw it, a shape small and slumped, hunched against the lee side of a boulder, barely visible under a crust of snow. He pulled Buck to a stop, squinted through the white. At first he thought it might be a wolf curled up in the rocks, but wolves didn't wear beads. As he drew closer, he saw slender fingers poking out from under a thin deer-hide garment. Human. He slid from the saddle before his boots even hit the ground, stumbling in the deep snow. The girl was barely conscious, her lips bluish-purple, her breathing shallow and raspy. Her skin, what little of it showed, was pale with cold, and her hair was frozen in thin black strands across her face. She couldn't have been more than 19. Apache by the look of her cheekbones sharp, eyes long and closed tight, as if the cold were something she could still shut out. Boone had seen death plenty of times on cattle drives, in saloons, even once in a duel, but this wasn't death yet. Not quite. He crouched beside her, checking her pulse, her breath. Still there. Weak, but there. Her eyes fluttered open slightly, dark as storm-soaked earth. They locked onto his, unblinking. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, just stared half here, half gone. For a moment he hesitated. The snow swirled around them like 1,000 whispered warnings. This was Apache country. He knew the stories white men who helped the wrong Indian didn't live long. But those stories felt small now. This wasn't a raider. This was a girl. A dying one. And Boone wasn't the kind of man who let someone freeze just because the world told him to. Without another thought, he unstrapped his bedroll from behind the saddle and pulled out his most prized possession, a thick woolen blanket. Hand-woven. Blue and gray with fading stripes, his grandmother's work. It had warmed him through deserts and snow, across rivers and mountains. The last thing she ever gave him before the fever took her. He'd sworn he'd never part with it. But now, he did. He wrapped it gently around the girl's shaking shoulders. She blinked up at him, surprised, not afraid, just confused. Her fingers, stiff and raw, clutched the fabric like it was the first real thing she'd felt in days. Boone spoke softly, unsure if she could even hear him. "You're gonna be all right," he said. "You hear me?" She said nothing, but her eyes didn't let go of his. He built a fire the best he could, shielding the small flames behind a wall of rocks, and his own body. He fed it with dry brush and a few sticks from his saddlebag, feeding the heat close to her side. From his pocket, he pulled a strip of jerky and offered it. She didn't take it at first. Then slowly, she reached out. Her hand brushed his, and for just a second, he felt the warmth beginning to return to her skin. She pointed at herself, barely whispering. "Ayanna." He nodded. "Boone." They sat together in silence, the wind roaring above but muted down in the rock basin. Every few minutes, he looked at her to make sure she was still breathing. She watched him too quietly, closely, as if trying to memorize his face. The fire crackled between them. Boone rubbed his hands together, teeth chattering, and muttered, "Hell of a place for fate to stir up trouble." He chuckled under his breath. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. As the sky darkened and the snow began to slow, Boone leaned back against the stone wall and let himself breathe. The girl was still alive. That was something. He looked at the blanket wrapped tight around her, already damp with melted snow, and for a flicker of a moment, wondered what his grandmother would think. He figured she'd understand. She was always telling him that warmth meant more than possession. When dawn touched the sky with pale light, Ayanna stood slowly and reached to return the blanket. But Boone raised a hand, stopping her. "You keep it," he said. "You need it more than I do." She stared at him, then at the blanket, then back. Her expression shifted, confused, almost alarmed. She said something fast in Apache, motioning to the fabric, to herself, then to him. Her tone carried weight, like she was warning him of something serious. But Boone didn't understand. He just smiled faintly, mounted his horse, and rode off with a nod. "Stay warm," he called. He thought he'd never see her again. He was wrong. By mid-afternoon, the storm had burned itself out, leaving behind a hushed, brittle landscape wrapped in white. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold lingered like a threat. Boone reached the trading post near the mouth of the pass, a squat stone building with smoke curling from its chimney, surrounded by a few outbuildings and pine trees that looked like they'd been punched by the storm. His horse gave a grateful snort as they stepped into the clearing. Boone dismounted, his limbs sore from the cold, and pounded on the door. Inside, the heat wrapped around him like a blanket. It smelled of wood smoke, whiskey, and tobacco. 3 men sat hunched at a rough table near the hearth, playing cards. One of them, a wiry fellow with a scar across his jaw, looked up with wary eyes. Behind the counter, a grizzled man set down the rifle he'd been cleaning and raised his eyebrows. "Well, hell." Boone caught right. He grunted. "I figured the storm swallowed you whole." Boone shook off his coat and knocked snow from his boots. "Came close," he muttered. "I need coffee." "And news." Murphy, the trader, poured him a tin cup of black brew thick enough to chew. "You pick a hell of a time to ride through Apache country." Boone didn't answer. He wrapped his cold hands around the steaming cup, but the warmth didn't reach his gut. His mind kept drifting back to the girl in the snow. Ayanna. He could still see the way she'd looked at him when he refused to take the blanket back, like he'd done something enormous and didn't even know it. The man with the scar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "See anything out there?" "Smoke riders." Boone shook his head slowly. "Just snow." "Lucky. Word is, Apache been moving through the hills, not raiding yet, but watching, real close. Some wagon train got hit last week 20 miles south. Took everything. Left the folks with their throats cut. Every last one of 'em." He spat into a dented brass spittoon. "They're animals. Boone, you see one of 'em. You ride the other way." "That's what smart men do." Boone said nothing. The tin cup in his hand felt suddenly heavier. Ayana's eyes flashed in his memory, exhausted. Brave. Vulnerable. She wasn't an animal. She was a human being who'd been freezing to death in the snow, and he'd saved her. But he didn't say that. These men wouldn't understand. They saw Apache as a threat, not as people. Boone took another sip of the bitter coffee and let the silence speak for him. Murphy broke the quiet. You can bunk here tonight. Got an empty room in the back. But if I were you, I'd ride at first light. Boone looked at him. Why Murphy didn't answer right away. He just glanced toward the window where the sky was already darkening. Then, almost like an answer, it came. Boom. A low thudding sound, steady, deep, like a heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. The men froze. Even the card player with the scar straightened, his jaw tight. There it is again, he muttered. Been going since yesterday. You hear that? Murphy, the trader, nodded. Drums. Message drums. They're talking to each other out there. I don't know what about. But it ain't good. Boone set down his cup. The sound was faint but rhythmic, coming from the ridges. He stepped toward the window. Beyond the frost-streaked glass, the pine trees stood silent and still, but something moved beyond them, not visibly, just felt, a presence, a knowing. He thought about Ayana again, the urgency in her voice when she'd tried to return the blanket, the way she'd pointed at herself, and then at him. Her words hadn't made sense then, but now, with the drums rising all around them like a warning, he felt it deep in his bones. Whatever he had done by giving her that blanket, it wasn't just kindness. It had meant something, and someone out there had taken notice. Morning broke sharp and silent. No bird song, no wind. Just a strange stillness that made the hairs on Boone's neck stand on end. He'd barely slept. The drums had stopped some time before sunrise, but their echo remained in his chest, pulsing like a second heartbeat. He dressed fast, layered his coat, and stepped out into the snow-blanketed clearing behind the trading post. Buck, his horse, was restless, ears twitching, hooves shifting. Something had spooked him. Boone ran a hand down the gelding's neck, whispering low to calm him. From the main building, Murphy appeared with his rifle, eyes scanning the trees. They're out there, he said. Didn't see a soul all night, but I felt him, watching. Boone nodded. He knew the feeling too well, like being hunted by ghosts with real hands. I'm heading out, Boone said, tightening his saddle straps. You're crazy, came a voice from the porch, Scarjaw, still chewing a toothpick like it was the last piece of courage he had. You ride out there. They'll put an arrow in your spine before you clear the ridge. Boone swung into the saddle. If they want me, hiding inside won't save me. He rode slow, deliberately, his hands away from his weapons. The valley stretched out before him in quiet dread. Pines stood like sentinels in the mist, and snow muffled every hoofbeat until even his own presence felt like a secret. Then they appeared. 7 Apache warriors stepped out from the tree line as one silent, unhurried, blocking the trail like spirits made flesh. They didn't raise weapons. They didn't speak. They just watched. Boone's heart thundered. He reined Buck to a stop, scanning their faces. Each man wore war paint, feathers, beads. Horses painted with white symbols stood still beneath them, as if carved from the earth itself. At their center, an elder sat atop a horse like he'd been born there. His hair was long, tied in leather cords, his eyes hard as carved obsidian. Then, through the wall of men, a familiar figure emerged, Ayana. She wore the same deerskin dress as before, but now Boone's blanket, blue and gray, was wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak of office. Her eyes met his, and something in Boone's chest shifted. This was no coincidence. This was a summons. The elder raised a hand and spoke, his words flowing like a river churning through stone. Boone didn't understand, but he felt the weight of every syllable. Ayana stepped forward and began to translate, her voice calm, but heavy. "My grandfather says, you have claimed me." Boone blinked. "Claimed you?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "The blanket. When a man gives his blanket to a woman to warm her body, without being her kin, in our tradition, that is a vow, a promise, a marriage." Boone reeled in the saddle. "That's not what I meant. I was trying to save your life." Ayana nodded slightly. "I know. But intention means little. Action means everything." He looked at the blanket, now a symbol heavier than any weapon. "I didn't know." "No one told me you were told," she interrupted gently. "I tried." "You smiled and rode away." She paused, voice softening. "I don't think you're a cruel man," Boone Cartwright, "but you made a promise in a language older than your country. And now, they've come to see if you will keep it." The elder Nalnish, Ayana called him, spoke again. His voice was steady, commanding. Ayana hesitated to translate this time. "He asks," she said slowly, "if you would have given your blanket to an Apache man." Boone opened his mouth, closed it, thought. The answer was as bitter as the cold. Probably not. Ayana nodded once, sadly. That's what he expected. "He says you saw me as a woman first, Apache second, and while that is rare, it carries responsibility." One of the younger warriors shifted in his saddle. His eyes burned hotter than the rest. His hand brushed the hilt of his blade. Ayana glanced at him. "Kuruk, my cousin. He says you should marry me now, or face the consequences." Boone's jaw tightened. "What kind of consequences?" Ayana lowered her gaze. "If you walk away, you shame me. And them. Honor must be restored. The old way, with blood." Boone stared at the snow beneath his horse. Everything in him screamed for reason, for a way to explain, to undo. But there was no undoing. Not now. He looked back at Ayana. She stood alone in the circle, the blanket still around her, shoulders straight despite the fire behind her eyes. He realized something. Then this wasn't just a test for him. It was a burden she had to carry too. Caught between worlds, caught between men, and the cost of his kindness, unintended or not, was now hers to bear. "There has to be another way," he said finally. "Some way I can make this right, without lying." Nalnish studied him for a long time, then spoke again, short and sharp. Ayana turned. "He says, you speak like a warrior, not a coward. He will consider your words, but first, you must come to our village, face our customs, our truth. Only then can you ask for mercy." Kuruk snapped something in Apache, and Nalnish silenced him with a single look. Still, the young man's hand remained near his knife. His glare said what his mouth didn't. One mistake. White man. Just one. Boone exhaled slowly. He turned to Ayana. "If I go with you, do I get to speak my piece?" She nodded. "You'll be given trials. 3 of them. That is our way." Boone looked once more at the silent men surrounding him, then at Ayana. "Then I ride with you, and so, flanked by warriors and watched by ancestors, Boone couldn't name, the cowboy who had once lived by no law, but the wind turned his horse toward the mountains and toward the life he never meant to claim, The trail into the Apache Mountains was steep and silent. Snow still clung to the higher ridges, but here in the low pass, it melted into mud and pine needles. Boone rode behind Ayana and Nalnish, flanked on both sides by warriors who never spoke, never smiled, never dropped their guard. Their presence wasn't threatening yet. It was clear they were escorting, not welcoming. He felt it with every hoofbeat. For the first time in years, Boone felt small. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the rhythm of horses and the rustle of wind through evergreens. Ayana glanced back occasionally, her eyes unreadable. Finally, when the group paused to water the horses, Boone rode up beside her. "I didn't mean for this," he said quietly. "Back there, the blanket. It wasn't a marriage proposal." Ayana didn't look at him. "I know, but the land doesn't care what you meant, only what you did." Boone looked away, jaw tight. "Then let me do something now that makes sense. I'm not running. I won't shame you. But marriage, that's a choice, not a trap." He took a deep breath. "Give me a way to prove myself. Your way, your rules." She finally met his eyes. "There is a way." But the moment she spoke those words, Kuruk spun his horse around and cut between them. His face twisted with fury. "You think he deserves that?" Kuruk snapped in English, thick with accent but clear enough. "You give him trials meant for men of the blood, men who know our ways." He pointed at Boone like an accusation. "He gives a blanket and thinks that's enough." Ayana stood her ground, calm but firm. He did not run. He did not lie. He stands here now. Kuruk spat. "So he gets rewarded for ignorance." His hand moved to the hilt of his knife again. "Let me settle it with steel." Nalnish raised his hand, stopping Kuruk mid-motion. He said something sharp in Apache. Boone couldn't understand the words, but the effect was immediate. Kuruk backed off, jaw clenched, eyes still burning holes through Boone's chest. Ayana spoke again, translating her grandfather's decree. "The trials are permitted. Strength, wisdom, sacrifice. He will face them. If he fails, the promise is broken. If he flees, the shame becomes blood." Boone nodded. "I won't run, and I won't fail." Kuruk's stare didn't soften. He muttered something under his breath, something Boone couldn't quite catch. But the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. They rode on. As the sun dipped low and bathed the cliffs in gold, the Apache village revealed itself like a secret, unveiled by the land. Hidden in a valley between sheer red rock walls, it blended with the earth homes built from timber, stone, and hides, arranged in a ring around a central fire pit. Smoke drifted lazily upward, and the sound of distant voices, children, women, drums echoed off the canyon walls. The moment Boone's presence was noticed, all noise ceased. Faces appeared in doorways. Children paused mid-game. Elders rose from their places by the fire. All eyes turned toward the white man riding with their warriors. He dismounted slowly, every instinct in him screaming to keep his hands visible, his movements measured. He didn't feel like a guest. He felt like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Ayana stepped beside him, her expression unreadable again. "Will they let me speak?" Boone asked. "Not today," she said. "Tonight. They watch. They measure you with silence first." They moved toward the center of the village. Boone noticed symbols painted on hides, feathers strung between posts, bones carved and hung like wind chimes. Every step he took felt like stepping further from the world he knew and deeper into something older, sacred, and unforgiving. At the main fire pit, Nalnish stood beside a log circle. Boone followed his lead and waited as villagers began to gather around the men with lined faces and spears in hand. Women with braids bound in silver beads, children with wide eyes clinging to their mothers. Then, from the largest lodge, a woman emerged. She was small but moved like a storm in flesh. Her silver hair was braided down to her waist, adorned with turquoise and shells that clicked softly with each step. Her eyes were sharp, colder than stone, and they landed on Boone with a force that nearly made him look away. Ayana whispered, "My grandmother." Imala. Imala circled Boone once without speaking, then stopped in front of him and let loose a torrent of Apache. Her voice was fierce, rising and falling like war drums. She pointed at him, at Ayana, at the blanket still draped over her shoulders. She spat words into the dust, as if casting out poison. Boone didn't understand a word, but he understood tone and shame when it hit him like a slap. Ayana's face flushed, her voice dropped as she translated. "She says you reek of whiskey and violence, that I've brought shame to our family, that you've cursed me with confusion, with false kindness." She swallowed hard. "She says I should have burned the blanket instead of wearing it." The crowd murmured. Some nodded. Others stayed stone-faced. Boone stood still, hands open at his sides, taking it. He deserved it. Then a voice rose from the crowd, younger, hotter. A young man with a strong build and eyes filled with fury stepped forward, his hand already at the knife on his belt. Kuruk again. He shouted something at Ayana, stepping dangerously close. She tried to step back, but he caught her arm. Boone's blood surged, but before he could move, Ayana pulled free and shouted back in her native tongue. Kuruk turned to Boone and spoke in broken English, each word like a blow. "You trick her. You lie. You act dumb, but you know what you did. You took what wasn't yours. You dishonor her, dishonor us." Then he stepped forward and hissed, "If you stay, you bleed." Boone didn't blink. "I didn't take anything. I gave." Kuruk's eyes narrowed. "Then you give your life, or you leave like a coward." Imala barked a sharp command. Kuruk paused, then stepped back, but his hand never left the knife. The fire popped between them, and the circle tightened. Ayana's voice broke the silence. "She says I must choose. I must either allow you to prove yourself by trial, or renounce you and accept Kuruk's hand." Boone looked at her, really looked. She stood straight, proud, but her eyes were glassy with pain, caught between fear and duty. "And if I fail," he asked. Her answer came quiet and swift. "Then the mountain will take you, and I will belong to him." The sun barely pierced the canyon walls the next morning. Smoke from cook fires hung low in the air, and the village moved with the slow rhythm of early light. Boone awoke on a woven mat inside a small lodge built for outsiders, he could tell, because it sat just outside the main circle of homes. Separate, temporary, like him. He rolled to his feet, feeling the stiffness in his joints. They hadn't taken his guns, but they hadn't offered trust either. A boy, no more than 12, stood at the doorway, silent, watching. When Boone nodded at him, the boy didn't move, just turned and trotted off into the mist. Outside, eyes followed him, not openly hostile but cautious, quiet, observant. Mothers called their children back when he walked by. Warriors crossed their arms, elders whispered in shadows, and Ayana, she kept her distance. Not cold, but unreachable. She walked among her people with the blanket folded over one arm now, never wearing it again. Boone didn't blame her. He spent the morning splitting wood near the cook fires under the supervision of an older man named Taklish. The man spoke no English, but every swing of his axe seemed to judge Boone's worth. By midday, Boone's palms bled. He kept going. No one asked him to do it. That was the point. In the evenings, Ayana sat across the fire from him, translating fragments of the language, naming things aloud: fire, horse, water, mountain, friend. She made no promises, no warm gestures, just words. Still, Boone listened. Every one of them felt like a step toward the cliff's edge. If he didn't learn fast, he would fall. The Apache way of life was precise, ancient, interwoven with silence and gesture. A glance meant more than a sentence. A pause between words could hold warning or blessing. Boone, used to loud saloons and straight talk, found himself stumbling often. One night, he reached out to take food from a pot before an elder had eaten. A small girl tugged his sleeve and shook her head firmly. Lesson learned. He began to notice patterns: how warriors tied their moccasins with red twine when in mourning, how women avoided looking a grieving man in the eyes, how firewood was stacked in a spiral near the lodge of a sick child, how no one ever asked for help, but help always came. He also noticed how Kuruk never stopped watching him. One evening, after a long day of cutting brush, Boone sat near the edge of the village, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. Ayana approached quietly, her arms folded, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She sat beside him without a word. For a time, they watched the sun bleed over the canyon rim. Finally, she spoke. "You want to know why I was in the storm?" He said nothing, just waited. She didn't look at him when she continued. "3 nights before you found me, I was told I'd marry Kuruk. No courtship, no choice. It was decided by my grandmother, by the council. Kuruk had proven himself as a hunter, as a warrior. That was enough." She finally looked at Boone. "But not for me." Boone's voice was low. "So you ran. I took my grandfather's horse and rode into the hills. I thought I'd find my uncle's camp. I thought I had time. But the storm came early." Boone stared at the dirt near his boots, "and I showed up with a damn blanket." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You didn't know. That's what makes it worse and better." He turned to her. "I'm sorry. I know." She paused. "That's why I want you to survive the trials." Her voice faltered just slightly on the last word. Boone caught it. "And if I do?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, maybe the ancestors knew what they were doing. In the days that followed, Kuruk's resentment deepened. Boone caught him circling the lodge one night, blade in hand, tracing something into the snow. He vanished when spotted, but left behind 3 long scratches across Boone's saddle. A warning, a line drawn. The elders noticed too. Murmurs passed between them at fire circles, and Nalnish kept a closer eye on both men. Kuruk was respected but impulsive, proud, dangerous, and now unstable. One afternoon, while Ayana taught Boone the meaning of certain woven bead colors, Kuruk passed by and spat in the dirt. "You waste your tongue," he muttered in Apache. "He'll fail, just like the others before." Ayana rose to speak, but Boone shook his head. "Let it go," he said. But inside, he wasn't calm. He'd grown up breaking horses, dodging bandits, hauling cattle across rivers in full flood, but nothing had ever made him feel so exposed as being unarmed in the center of an angry world. And yet, somewhere in the quiet, he was beginning to understand something he hadn't before. These people, this land, it had rules, not written, but real, older than maps or treaties. Boone had stepped into their story by accident. Now he had to earn his place in it, whether by trial or by blood. The morning air was sharp with frost, though the sun had already begun to rise over the canyon. Drums echoed faintly from the village as Boone stepped out of his lodge to find the entire tribe gathered in a wide circle near the central fire. Warriors stood with painted faces, elders seated with carved staffs in hand, and Ayana stood beside Nalnish, her expression unreadable. Kuruk stood nearby as well, arms crossed, the white paint across his cheeks drawn in jagged lines like lightning bolts. His gaze was fixed not on the fire, but on Boone. Nalnish raised one hand and spoke in Apache, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the canyon. Ayana translated without ceremony. "You will be tested. Strength first. The mountain will measure your will. You will climb Tsehna, our sacred cliff. At the top is a nest. From it, you must retrieve one feather of the black eagle." She looked Boone in the eye. Alive. A murmur ran through the onlookers. Even Boone caught the shift in mood. He glanced around. "Why do they look like I've already failed?" Ayana's voice was soft but steady. 3 men have tried in the last 10 winters. One returned with broken legs. The others did not return. Boone stared at her a moment, then nodded once. "Then I better make this count." They rode out in silence, just Boone, Kuruk, and an elder named Nahiko, who bore the ceremonial staff and guided the way. Chena loomed above them like a wall forged by gods, its red cliffs jagged and unforgiving. The air thinned as they approached, and wind howled down the pass like a warning. At its base, Kuruk dismounted and handed Boone a single leather cord. "For your waist," he said with a cruel smirk, "so they can drag your body back when you fall." Boone tied it anyway. Nahiko stepped forward and held out a carved talisman, 3 eagle feathers bound by sinew. "For balance of mind," he said. Boone tucked it inside his coat and turned toward the cliff. He began climbing. The stone was cold, rough, and cut his fingers almost immediately. There was no path, only natural ledges and cracks barely wide enough for boot toes. As he ascended, the air grew thinner, the ledges narrower, and his body heavier. He slipped twice within the first hour, once catching himself with a desperate grab, once barely saving his boot from a deadly drop. Halfway up, the wind picked up. Gusts slammed his body into the wall. He clung to a rock face like a spider, every muscle burning. He could see nothing below now, just void. His breath came in sharp bursts, and blood oozed from his scraped palms. Doubt crept in. A voice whispered, "This is madness. No feather is worth this." But another voice, deeper, harder, replied, "You didn't ride all this way to quit when the sky gets close." So he climbed higher. Hours passed. His shoulders throbbed, legs trembled, mouth bone dry. But at last, he saw it a ledge no wider than a saddle, cradling a great eagle's nest built from branches as thick as arms. The eagle wasn't there. Boone hauled himself onto the ledge and crouched, breath ragged, hands shaking. The nest loomed before him, massive, ancient, feathers and bones woven into its base. He reached in slowly. Then a shriek pierced the wind. From above, the black eagle dove, wings outstretched, talons gleaming, a streak of fury in the sky. Boone barely rolled aside as claws slashed past his head. He pressed his back against the cliff, heart pounding. The eagle wheeled and came again, eyes locked on his. This time he didn't dodge. As it swooped, he raised his arms, let it strike, and grabbed. The eagle shrieked in outrage, wings flailing as Boone locked it against his chest. One claw gashed his shoulder, but he held firm. With his free hand, he reached into the nest and plucked a single feather long, black, gleaming like obsidian. Then he let the bird go. It soared into the sky with a scream that echoed across the canyon. Boone stared after it, then tucked the feather into his shirt. Blood soaked his sleeve, and his head spun from the altitude, but he grinned. "I got it," he muttered. "Damn it, I got it." The descent was agony. His arms shook, legs buckled, vision blurred. Once, he nearly lost grip and dangled from one hand for a full minute before swinging back onto the wall. But inch by inch, he made it down. By the time his boots hit the canyon floor, the sun had dipped low and the shadows stretched long. Kuruk stood waiting. When Boone approached, bloodied and limping, he didn't speak, just looked, eyes narrowed, then turned and walked back toward the village. That night, the fire burned high. The tribe gathered once more in silence. Boone stepped into the ring, still in his torn coat, face cut and hands wrapped in rawhide. He held out the feather. Nalnish took it without a word, examined it, then raised it high. A shout rang out short, sharp. The crowd echoed it. A circle of respect had formed. Boone wasn't embraced. Not yet, but he was no longer invisible. The warriors nodded. Elders watched with new eyes. Even Imala, stern and still, didn't frown. Ayana approached after the ceremony, stopping just close enough to speak. "No one thought you'd return." Boone's voice rasped. "Neither did I." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, her gaze wasn't guarded. "You earned the right to stay," she said. But that was only the beginning. Boone nodded, glancing up toward the darkened cliffs. "Then let the mountain keep my blood. I've got more to give." 2 days after the eagle feather trial, Boone awoke before dawn, his muscles still sore, his shoulder bandaged in leather and pine salve. The village was quiet, save for the distant crackle of fire and the low breath of horses. A shadow loomed at the doorway of his lodge. "Ayana, you're summoned," she said simply. "It is time." He rose, dressed, and followed her through the village. The elders waited near the path that led west, away from the cliffs, into a ravine thick with fog and stories. Nahiko held a staff etched with animal symbols and handed it to Boone. Nalnish stepped forward. "You will go alone," Ayana translated. "Into the place we call Hojo's Hollow. There, the ancestors speak. You must listen not with ears, but with spirit. You must return before the next sunrise with the truth. Not a fact, not a story. A truth that no man has ever told you." Boone raised an eyebrow. "That's the trial." Ayana's voice was low. "It breaks more men than the climb." Without another word, Boone stepped into the mist. Hojo's Hollow swallowed him whole. The trail narrowed between blood-red canyon walls, the air growing still and warm as he descended. Strange carvings marked the stone spirals, animals with human eyes, thunderbirds locked in circles. No wind moved here, no birds sang. Even his boots made no sound on the earth. After an hour, he began to lose track of time. The canyon twisted and branched, then looped back. He swore he passed the same rock formation 3 times. Hunger gnawed at his belly. Thirst dried his lips. He sat once to rest, and when he rose, the light had changed either dusk or dawn. He couldn't tell. Then the visions began. He first saw a deer with eyes like Ayana's, watching from the rocks. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared until he looked away, and when he turned back, it was gone. Later, He found a fire burning in the middle of the path. No wood, no source, just flame. He reached toward it, and it vanished. The worst came near the center of the hollow, where the canyon widened into a basin shaped like a bowl. There, seated on a flat stone, was his father. At least, it looked like his father. Hat tilted low, rifle across his knees, silver in his beard. He looked up and grinned. "Well, boy," the figure said, "you finally outran your shame." Boone froze. "You're not real. Neither is pride," the man said, "but that didn't stop you from chasing it your whole life." Boone backed away. The canyon rippled like heat on desert rock. The figure laughed, then vanished into dust. Boone fell to his knees. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the chill. "What truth," he whispered to no one. "What truth are you hiding from me in the deepest part of the hollow?" Just before dawn, he stumbled upon it, a tree, a single twisted juniper growing straight from the rock, its roots bleeding down the cliff like veins. Hanging from its branches were dozens of items: baby shoes, arrows snapped in half, a strand of gray hair, feathers tied to red cloth, offerings, grief, memory. At its base sat a stone bowl, and in it water so still it reflected not the canyon above, but the sky of another time. Boone stared into it and saw himself 12 years old, watching his brother bleed out in a saloon fight. The man who killed him had walked free. Boone never cried, never spoke of it again. He rode away the next day and never went back. The memory pierced him like an arrow. He dropped to his knees, touched the water, and whispered, "I should have stayed. I should have buried him." In that moment, the silence broke. Wind moved, the tree creaked, and something deep within him, something long buried, shook loose. He stood, took a small stone from beneath the tree, and placed it in his pocket. He emerged from the canyon just as the first pink light touched the horizon. His boots were torn, his eyes hollow, but his spine was straight. The village saw him coming and gathered once more. Nalnish, Ayana, and even Imala waited at the fire. "What did you find?" Ayana asked. Boone held out the stone. "I found the weight I never carried." They didn't ask him to explain. They didn't need to. Nalnish took the stone, looked it over, then nodded once and passed it to Imala. The old woman closed her eyes, whispered something, and placed the stone into the ashes of the fire. Ayana's voice barely rose above the crackle. "You brought back truth. You faced what your people bury. That is wisdom." Kuruk was silent. For the first time, he didn't speak, didn't sneer. He simply turned and walked away. Boone stood there, blinking against the morning sun, unsure what had changed, only that something had. Ayana stepped closer. "One trial remains." He nodded. "Sacrifice." She didn't smile. The one no man can fake. The morning after his return from Hozo's Hollow, Boone stood before the fire once more. The village gathered in complete silence. Even the dogs didn't bark, as if the canyon itself held its breath. Nalnish stepped forward, staff in hand, and spoke. Ayana translated beside him, her voice tight. "The final trial is not strength or wisdom. It is sacrifice. You must give up what you love most, not for honor, not for reward, but because love is not proven by words or promises, but by what one is willing to lose." Boone blinked, throat dry. "And if I give nothing, then you gain nothing," Ayana said. "And the path ends here." Kuruk stood across the circle, arms folded, smirking. "He has nothing to give," he muttered. But Boone did, and it tore at him. He turned to Ayana. "Will you tell me what to give?" "No," she said, Because if I did, it wouldn't be sacrifice. That night, Boone sat alone by the stream that ran along the village edge. Stars glittered above, and the wind whispered through the pines like an old song. Ayana approached without sound and sat beside him. She didn't speak, neither did he for a long while. Then he said, quietly, "Before I came here, I didn't know what love meant. I've been in plenty of saloons, woken up in plenty of places. But none of that mattered." Ayana looked at him. "And now I'd give everything just to stay close to this fire. To feel the ground here, to hear the way you say my name." She turned away. "Then don't say that. Not if you mean to leave." "I don't want to," Boone said. "But maybe that's what sacrifice is." She said nothing more, but her hand found his. That night, under the cold stars, Boone didn't sleep. He stared into the dark and decided. At dawn, he packed his things, quietly, slowly. His coat was still torn from the cliff, his boots still crusted with canyon dust, but the heaviest thing he carried was the folded blanket, the one he'd once given without understanding. Ayana waited at the edge of the village. Her eyes searched his face, already knowing. She didn't cry, but her jaw trembled when she spoke. "You're walking away." He nodded. "I have to. If I stay, I take something from you. Your choice, your future, maybe your place here. You could stay and be part of it," she said, "but not without cost, and not without doubt." She swallowed. "So this is the sacrifice." "I thought it'd be something else," Boone whispered. "But it's you. It was always you." He took the blanket and placed it gently in her hands. "I give this back. Not because I don't love you, but because I do." She clutched it, shaking. "You'll always be part of this place," she said, "even if your feet never touch it again." Boone walked to the fire circle, alone. The tribe stood waiting. Kuruk was already there, watching with narrowed eyes. Nalnish spoke solemnly, and Ayana translated once more. "He has chosen his sacrifice. He has given his bond back. He has left love behind, not for pride, not for power, but because it was asked." Boone placed the blanket on the ground and stepped back. Silence. Then Imala stepped forward slowly, with the weight of decades in each step. She picked up the blanket, examined it, then looked at Boone with something that might have been respect. She turned to Ayana. "You may choose now." Ayana didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, lifted the blanket, and draped it over Boone's shoulders once again. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ayana's voice rang out clear, proud, full of fire. His sacrifice was real. "But love chooses too, and I choose him," Kuruk shouted in fury, but Nalnish raised his hand. "She has spoken," he said. The drums began low, steady, solemn. Boone turned to Ayana, eyes wide. "You why? Because sacrifice is not just about losing," she said. "It's about showing you are worthy to keep what truly matters." She smiled, tears in her eyes now. "And I'd rather stand beside a man who would give me up than one who never understood what I was worth." They stood together in the firelight, surrounded by warriors and elders and ancestors watching from the wind. The trials were over, but the story was just beginning.